The first mistake was ignoring her calls for 3 months. The second was moving without giving my new address to the one person who once promised she'd always find me. The biggest mistake was opening the door at almost midnight. Late autumn rain soaked the street. Porch light fell on a worn suitcase and soaked shoes. I caught rain mixed with lavender in her hair, exactly like 15 years ago. She looked at me, eyes red, and whispered, "I didn't know where else to go but you. I'm Ethan Brooks. ER nurse, Portland." At 33, I handled hundreds of hospital emergencies, but had no idea what to do with my childhood best friend on my porch, her whole life packed into one suitcase. For 15 years, I kept one rule. Never let Lily be disappointed in me again. I'm 33 years old. An emergency room nurse. Calm under pressure, quiet by nature, the kind of person who always puts other people first, sometimes to a fault. I live alone, in a small rented house with a porch light that stays on most nights, though I couldn't have told you exactly why. Co-workers describe me as reliable in a crisis, the person you want in the room when everything falls apart, precisely because I never seem to fall apart myself. What they don't see is how much of that calm was built out of necessity a long time ago, not choice. My mother died from a long illness when I was 16. My father buried himself in work afterward, slowly drifting further away with every passing year, until distance became the only language left between us. I learned 2 lessons from that year that never left me. Never ask anyone for help. Never let anyone stay long enough to leave. I told myself it was self-sufficiency. Looking back, it was probably just fear wearing a more respectable name. Lily Carter grew up 2 houses down from mine. She's 32 now, a children's book illustrator with a gentle, endlessly optimistic way of moving through the world, the kind of person who notices when you're having a bad day before you've said a single word about it. We met the way most childhood friendships start, without either of us choosing it. I was being cornered by a group of older kids on the playground when I was 8, too small and too quiet to fight back. Lily, who was standing nearby, picked up a kickball and threw it directly at the tallest kid's head with a precision that seemed almost surgical for an 8-year-old. "Leave him alone," she said, hands on her hips, like she'd just settled the matter permanently. She was right. Nobody bothered me again after that, not with Lily around. From that day on, we were inseparable. We walked to school together every morning. We did homework side by side at her kitchen table because mine was always too quiet to sit in alone. We built a small wooden fort in the oak tree between our 2 backyards, using scrap lumber Lily's father had left behind, and declared it our secret headquarters, off limits to every adult and every sibling on the street. We nailed a small wooden sign above the entrance, lettered clumsily in Lily's handwriting because mine, she insisted, looked like a doctor's prescription. We spent entire summers up there, trading comic books, arguing about which superhero would win in a fight, and making promises about the future neither of us fully understood yet. We split lunches when one of our families couldn't afford much that week, never once mentioning whose turn it actually was. Lily taught herself to be patient long enough to teach me how to ride a bike, running alongside me down the driveway until I finally stopped wobbling. And the night my mother died, Lily sat with me in the hospital hallway until sunrise, saying almost nothing, just staying, which turned out to be exactly what I needed. Somewhere in that same year, sitting on the floor of our tree fort with a flashlight between us, we made each other a promise neither of us fully understood the weight of yet. "If we ever get lost from each other," Lily said, "you just knock on my door. That's it. No explaining. Just knock." "Same rule for you," I said. We shook on it, the way kids do when they think a promise is simple. That promise would matter more than either of us could have guessed. Everything changed the summer I turned 15. Lily's father was transferred out of state for work, and within a few weeks, the house 2 doors down sat empty, a moving truck the last thing either of us watched drive away. We promised to call. We promised to write. Slowly, the way distance always wins over intention, the calls became fewer, the letters stopped altogether, and we each built entirely separate lives in cities that had nothing to do with each other. Which brings me back to 3 months ago, when my phone started lighting up with calls from an unknown number, over and over, at strange hours. I never answered. I assumed it was a scam call, or worse, someone from the past wanting to reminisce about a childhood I'd mostly packed away. I had no idea it was Lily. And then, at 11:47 on a rainy Tuesday night, someone knocked on my door. Lily was standing there. One suitcase beside her. No smile on her face at all. I opened the door and stepped aside without thinking, the way you do for someone who used to be family, even after years apart. I took her wet coat, set the suitcase down by the door, and pointed her toward the couch without really registering that I hadn't said a single word yet. "You're not going to ask why I'm here," she said, sitting down carefully, like she wasn't sure the couch would hold her weight. "I figured you'd tell me when you were ready." "That's very mature of you. I've had 15 years to practice patience." The apartment felt awkward for the first few minutes, both of us circling the same unspoken question of where exactly 15 years had gone. But old habits surfaced faster than either of us expected. We still called each other by the same childhood nicknames, the ones nobody else had used in over a decade. "You still can't cook," Lily said, glancing at the sad state of my kitchen. "Some things never change. You still drink cocoa with more sugar than actual cocoa. That's called having taste, Ethan. That's called a dental emergency waiting to happen. I work with children's books. I'm contractually obligated to enjoy sugar. That's not how contracts work. It's how mine works." She almost smiled at that, the first real crack in the tired, guarded look she'd worn since I opened the door. The air between us slowly warmed as the evening went on. I handed her a towel to dry her hair, and without thinking, she reached over and straightened my collar the exact same way she used to when we were kids, an old habit neither of us had planned on resurrecting. "You always did that," I said. "Even when we were 10. You always let me. I never noticed I let you. That's the whole problem with you, Ethan. You never notice the things that matter until someone points them out." I didn't have a response for that, mostly because she was right, and we both knew it. Then she said something quietly, almost to herself. "Being here already feels more like home than anywhere I've been in months." I laughed it off, the way I always deflected things that landed too close to the truth. But something behind my eyes had already changed. I still didn't know why she'd shown up with a suitcase and nowhere else to go. Part of me assumed the obvious explanations. A breakup. Bankruptcy. A lost job, maybe a fight with family. I ran through every possibility that night, and every single one turned out to be wrong. Later that night, Lily's fever spiked without warning. Her whole body was shaking by the time I got a thermometer to her, and it didn't take my medical training to see what should have been obvious hours earlier. She hadn't just arrived tired. She'd been running on exhaustion for days, maybe longer, holding herself together through sheer stubbornness until the moment she finally reached somewhere safe enough to fall apart. I sat beside her, pressing a cool cloth against her forehead, the same way I imagined my mother once did for me, though I hadn't thought about that memory in years. "You should have called me sooner," I said quietly. "I tried," she mumbled, half asleep already. "You never picked up." The words landed harder than she probably meant them to. While she slept off the worst of the fever, I opened her suitcase to find a blanket, and what I found instead stopped me completely. A few changes of clothes. A childhood photo album, edges worn soft from handling. An old box of letters, tied together with string. And, tucked carefully at the bottom, the small stuffed bear I'd given her when we were 9 years old, missing one button exactly the way I remembered it. I sat there on the floor for a long moment, holding the bear in my hands, turning it over like it might explain something the rest of the suitcase couldn't. There was nothing else. No jewelry, no valuables, nothing that suggested a life packed up in a hurry for practical reasons. Whatever this was, it wasn't the suitcase of someone who'd simply lost a job or a lease. It was the suitcase of someone who had chosen, carefully and deliberately, exactly what was worth carrying when everything else had already been stripped away. Whatever had brought Lily to my door, it wasn't about money, or property, or anything that could be replaced. By the time I turned off the lights, Lily had curled around that suitcase in her sleep, holding it against her chest like it was the last solid thing left in the entire world. I stood in the doorway a moment longer than I needed to, watching her breathe, before finally closing the door and letting the apartment go quiet. Late that night, I sat on the floor beside the couch, listening to the rain slow against the window. Lily stirred awake sometime past 2, blinking at the dark room like she wasn't entirely sure where she was. "You didn't have to sit there all night," she said, her voice still thick with sleep. "I know. You look terrible. I have work in 5 hours. I'll survive." She managed a small smile, weak but real, the fever finally starting to break. The apartment was completely quiet. Rain traced slow lines down the window glass, and somewhere down the street a car passed, tires hissing against the wet road before fading out again. "Were you ever angry at me?" she asked. "For disappearing?" I thought about lying, softening it the way I soften most things. "Yeah," I admitted instead. "For a while. But I was angrier at myself. I let it happen too. I could have found you. I just didn't try hard enough." She let out a small, tired laugh. "You still talk like you're reading off a clipboard. You still laugh when you're about to cry." "Old habits," she said quietly. "I noticed you do that," I said. "Even as a kid. You'd laugh right before something serious came out. It buys me a few extra seconds before I have to actually say it." "You don't need extra seconds. Not with me." She was quiet for a long moment, staring down at her hands folded in her lap. Then, slowly, the real story came out. Her parents had died in a car accident a year earlier. She'd sold the family house just to cover the medical debt left behind. The man she'd been engaged to left almost immediately after the funeral, unable, or unwilling, to carry any of the weight with her. Distant relatives fought over what little remained of the estate, picking it apart piece by piece while she stood by, too exhausted to argue. "I kept waiting for someone to step in," she said. "A relative, a friend, anyone. Nobody did. Everyone had their own excuses. Everyone was very sorry, and very busy." "Where were you living, all this time?" "A friend's couch, for a while. Then a coworker's spare room. Then a motel, until the motel got expensive enough that I stopped being able to justify it." I hadn't realized, until that moment, how long she'd been quietly falling before she finally landed on my doorstep. By the end of it, she had no home left. Not one place on the entire map that belonged to her anymore. "The money wasn't the part that broke me," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It was realizing I didn't have anywhere left to call home. Not one single place." "Why here?" I asked. "Why me, after all this time?" She reached into the suitcase and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper, soft at the creases from being opened and closed too many times to count. It was the old hand-drawn map of our tree fort, made back when we were 12, my handwriting still visible on the back in faded pencil. "If you ever have nowhere left to go, knock on my door." I had completely forgotten I'd written it. I remembered the fort, the flashlight, the promise we made that night, but somewhere along the way, the actual words had faded out of memory entirely, buried under 16 years of other things. She never had. "I carried this everywhere," she said. "Every apartment, every move, every version of my life since we were kids. I used to think it was silly, holding on to a piece of paper like that. But every time things got bad, I'd take it out and read it again, just to remember there was one place in the world that might still let me in. I cried for the first time in 17 years, sitting on that living room floor, the paper trembling slightly in my hands. I spent this whole year trying to stand back up on my own, Lily said. I told myself I didn't need anyone. But every single time things got unbearable, there was only one place I could picture feeling safe again. Here, I said. You, she said. It was always you. I never forgot you, I told her. I just convinced myself I didn't matter enough to reach out. That you'd moved on completely, and calling would only be a burden. You were never a burden, Ethan. Not once. Not for a single day of my life. I should have answered your calls, I said. All those weeks I let ring through, I told myself I was giving you space. I think I was just scared of what it would mean if you needed me and I couldn't be enough. You were always enough, she said. You just never believed it. I believe it now, I said quietly, and meant it more than anything I'd said in years. I reached over, took her hand, and pressed the spare key from my kitchen counter into her palm. This isn't a temporary place to stay, I said. This is home. She looked down at the key, then back up at me, and for the first time since she'd arrived on my porch, something in her face finally settled. The exhaustion didn't disappear entirely, but underneath it, something steadier had taken its place. Lily slowly began building a new life inside those walls. She applied for jobs during the day, cleared out the guest room, and spent an entire Saturday afternoon replanting the small dead garden bed behind the house, insisting it just needed someone patient enough to try. You don't have to fix everything at once, I told her one evening, watching her sort through a pile of second-hand curtains she'd found at a thrift store. I know, she said. I just like having something to do with my hands. It's easier than sitting still and thinking. I understood that more than she probably realized. I'd spent 17 years doing exactly the same thing, filling every quiet hour with something useful so the silence never had room to catch up with me. Some evenings we sat on the back steps after dinner, not talking much, just watching the sky change color over the yard. Those silences never felt heavy the way silence used to feel with anyone else. With Lily, quiet had always meant safety, not distance. I forgot how much I liked doing nothing with someone, she admitted one night. I spent this whole year thinking I had to earn every place I stayed. Here, I don't feel like I have to earn anything. You never did, I said. Not with me. One morning, she attempted to make breakfast and burned the toast so badly the smoke alarm went off, both of us laughing like kids while I fanned the kitchen with a dish towel. Some things never change, I said. I resent that. You should. It's accurate. You try flipping pancakes while emotionally processing an entire year of your life. I don't need to try. I already know I'd fail worse than you. Neither of us needed saving, we realized somewhere in those first few weeks. We were simply helping each other heal, one ordinary morning at a time. One weekend, I suggested we walk over to check on the old tree fort, half expecting it to be gone entirely. It was still there, weathered and falling apart at the corners, but standing. We spent the whole afternoon repairing it with mismatched lumber from my garage, laughing every time a board came loose again, rebuilding something neither of us had realized we still needed. Remember when we thought this place was enormous? Lily said, ducking under the low doorway. It was enormous. We were just very small. We were very small and very confident for no reason. That's most of childhood, honestly. Word got around eventually. A coworker from the hospital saw us together at the grocery store and mentioned it to half the ER staff within a week. Everyone who met Lily seemed to arrive at the same quiet conclusion almost instantly. We had always belonged to each other, long before either of us understood what that meant. A small conflict came a few months in, when Lily landed a steady job and started talking about finding her own apartment, worried she'd overstayed her welcome. You've done more than enough already, she said, staring at a rental listing on her laptop. I don't want to take advantage of that. I stayed quiet longer than I should have before finally saying what I actually meant. I don't want you to stay out of gratitude, I told her. I want you to stay because you want to be here too. Not because you feel like you owe me anything. She closed the laptop slowly. What if I do want to stay? She asked. For real. Not because I have nowhere else to go, but because I don't want to be anywhere else. Then stay, I said. She didn't answer right away. But she didn't pack a single box either. A year later, the house was full of plants. Lily had insisted on buying one at a time, until every windowsill held something green and growing. She published her first children's book that spring, dedicated to me on the very first page. I still remember the day the first copy arrived in the mail. Lily sat at the kitchen table turning it over in her hands like she couldn't quite believe it was real, tracing the cover with one finger before she even opened it. You did this, I told her. All of it. I just had a spare key. You had a lot more than a spare key, Ethan. The main characters were two children who built a fort in a tree, and promised each other they'd never truly be lost, as long as one of them knew where to knock. She read me the last page out loud one evening on the porch, her voice catching slightly at the final line, and I understood then that she hadn't just written a children's book. She'd written down the one thing she needed to believe was true. One rainy evening, almost exactly a year after that first night, there was a knock at the door. I opened it to find Lily standing on the porch. The same old suitcase in her hand. For a half second, my stomach dropped, old fear rushing back before I could stop it. I laughed before I could stop myself. Running away again already? She shook her head and opened the suitcase right there on the porch, rain still falling softly behind her. Inside was a new photo album, filled with pictures from the past year. A spare house key, identical to the one already on her keyring. And a marriage license, blank lines waiting to be filled in. I wanted to knock one more time, she said. On purpose this time. Not because I had nowhere else to go, but because this is exactly where I want to be, for the rest of my life. I just wanted to make sure, she added, smiling through the rain, that this time, we never lose each other again. I understood then that some people don't walk into your life to rescue you in a single dramatic moment. They walk in to remind you that home was never a place at all. It's simply wherever someone keeps the door open when you finally knock. We hung the old wooden sign back up on the porch that same night, the same childish handwriting still visible beneath a fresh coat of varnish. If you ever have nowhere left to go, knock on my door. Standing there in the rain with Lily's hand in mine, I thought about the version of myself who used to believe that needing someone made you a burden. He would never have imagined this porch, this suitcase, this life. I was grateful, more than I could have said out loud, that he'd been wrong. Do you still keep in touch with a childhood friend? If one day they knocked on your door and said, I have nowhere else to go, what would you do? Share your story in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories that touch the heart.